Welcome back to the National Cancer Policy Forum's workshop on cancer care and cancer research in the context of COVID-19 pandemic. I am lessons learned. I am Tony Rivas, professor of medicine, surgery, and molecular medical pharmacology at UCLA, director of tumor immunology at the Johnson Comprehensive Cancer Center, and the immediate past president of the American Association for Cancer Research. I will be co-moderating this second session with Jim Dorshaw, Director of the Division of Cancer Treatment and Diagnosis and the Deputy Director for Clinical and Translational Research at the National Cancer Institute. The objective of this session is to discuss the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic on the conduct of cancer clinical trials and review the changes made in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. And we try to depict this in this illustration that you have in this slide, where on the left, we had how clinical trials, oncology clinical trials were run before the pandemic, where it was centered on the site where the clinical trial was done. The patients had to go there, drugs were sent there, the patients would take them or even pick up oral drugs. The scans and labs had to be done on this center, and monitors were sent in to gather the data. With the pandemic, we had to adjust to this very quickly. It could no longer be this way. So it ended up centering on the patient, where the patient was the one that was being accessed. Drugs could be sent to the patients. Consent could be done remotely. Scans could be done in remote sites as opposed to having to go to a tertiary care center. And then the data was gathered from all over. And we hope that these changes and improvements could be maintained long term. So we're going to be discussing this in this session. We have an outstanding session. We'll begin with a keynote presentation by Mia Levy, who's the Sheva Foundation Director of Rush University Cancer Center and the System Vice President of Cancer Services at Rush System for Health. Following Dr. Levy, we will have, we'll hear from 5 speakers. Jane Perlmutter, patient advocate, to present on the patient perspective. Following her presentation, we will hear from my co-moderator, Jim Dorshaw, for an NCI perspective. Then Farid Melhim, Senior Vice President and Head of Acorn AI Labs at Medidata, to present from a data and technology perspective. Next will be Dietmar Berger, Chief Medical Officer and Global Head of Development at Sanofi, but he'll be speaking today as a member of Transcelerate. We'll conclude the session with a presentation by Sandeep Agrawal, active team lead for genitourinary malignancies at the FDA Center for Drug Development and Research and the Oncology Center of Excellence. Please note that the biographies of all of these speakers are in the briefing book, and they're posted on the workshop website. Before we launch into the presentations, I want to quickly review the format. The presentations have been pre-recorded and will play consecutively. At the after the last presentation, we'll begin a live discussion. So Jim and I will really encourage you to be involved in the workshop, to send in questions as you hear the presentations, and use the chat on the website to ask for these questions. So without other delay, we'll start with the presentations.
Hello, my name is Mia Levy, and I want to thank the National Cancer Policy Forum for the opportunity to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on clinical cancer research. These are my disclosures. Unlike much of the nation during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, the cancer centers did not have the ability to stop providing clinical cancer services because cancer cells don't shelter in place, and we provide essential life-saving treatments for our patients. And this includes sometimes those patients getting clinical trials, which we believe are the best care for those patients. And so we went through several phases within the context of clinical cancer centers of the pandemic and its impact on clinical research, starting with the initial shutdown and shift of resources to adaptation, and finally into this new phase of hardening of the new processes that we've put into place. When we originally shut down, many in-person clinical services were either delayed or shifted to virtual visits. Diagnostic and procedural services in particular really were only prioritizing emergency cases. And initially that did not include cancer clinical trial patients, and we really had to scramble. So there was a lack of access to these ancillary services that were creating some safety concerns for clinical trial patients who are on active treatment. During that shutdown, we also saw a major shift in staffing. Lab research staff, many of the labs were closed, and some of those staff ended up being redirected to develop and run in-house COVID-19 tests. Many of our clinical research nurses were backfilling clinical roles, answering hotlines, scheduling even. And many of our research coordinators were shifted to support new COVID therapeutic studies. Study startup activities, much of that shut down, and especially for cancer clinical trials, and a lot of that refocused on rapidly opening COVID-19 related clinical trials to find life-saving therapies for this very scary time. New accruals never stopped, but were certainly slowed during that time. And we prioritized those patients to be enrolled on therapeutic interventional trials where the clinical trial was actually the best treatment option for a patient who otherwise lacked a good standard of care option. We then entered into an adaptation phase. And in the adaptation phase, several things occurred. Well, first, when I mentioned how we did not have access to the many of the ancillary services, we had to, frankly, have a certain number of study deviations at the beginning of the pandemic. In order to get around this, we would send patients to the emergency department to get and coordinate with the ER physicians to get study scans for patients based on patient safety. Eventually, rapid COVID-19 testing became available, and this allowed some clinical trial screening and follow-up procedures to resume in the setting of having a patient come in and get a COVID test prior to having their procedure performed. And we did shift some of our ancillary services from more central labs to our local labs. Many other in-person activities that are traditionally done in a clinical trial setting were converted to virtual activities, including informed consents now being allowed to be electronic. Visits to receive oral investigational drugs were allowed to be mailed to the patient directly to their home, either from the medical center or from the sponsor with a third-party intermediary to maintain patient privacy. And many of these processes were pretty complex to set up, but are now very successful. Furthermore, we leveraged virtual visits in a way that had never been done before in clinical research for assessments of patient safety and study adherence. Of course, some of these adaptations were a bit challenging, specifically the virtual visits, with an ever-changing shift in technology requirements in the early days as we were, the medical center was trying to figure out which platforms we were going to be using. For patients who did not have access to that technology, many of our study coordinators did literally physical drive-by assessments of patients from their front door as they stood on the sidewalk and communicated over to them to make sure that they were still doing okay on the study endpoints. New accruals, however, technology assessment became part of the screening process for potentially eligible patients, and this did lead to a disparity in access to clinical trials when patients did not have access to a compatible device. All of this adaptation of the study protocols resulted in a huge amount of IRB work. Regulations state that any changes to study procedures require an IRB amendment. Well, we still take that very seriously. And so we had hundreds of study amendments submitted by our local investigators for changes to study procedures like virtual visits, like being able to mail the drug to the patient's home, and later by the sponsors who then eventually started incorporating it into their master protocols. But it took 6 months after the start of the pandemic, when we were doing this locally, for the FDA to finally publish a policy stating that it was not required for IRB approval for all these COVID-related study process changes. But we were happy that we had done it. We're now in the process of hardening, this ongoing work, and many of the processes that we implemented during the pandemic are now becoming part of the standard way we hope to do business moving forward, including those electronic consents and some of the virtual visits. You'll hear more about virtual visits later in the session, and the challenges that we have across state lines of performing them certainly are impacting clinical research just as much as patient care with the same challenges. In particular, one of the processes that has been possible in the past with virtual study audits really went to a scale that we had not seen before, and is an incredibly exciting opportunity, but it does require a lot of preparation, and there is not yet an industry standard technology that sponsors and institutions have settled on. And so we feel like we've tried any number of different technology solutions for sharing data with study auditors. And really, we haven't found one that is the best. Part of the challenge is that we need a business associates agreement with any technology that we use that's going to be used to share HIPAA protected information. And so even though there might have been some good technology options, if we didn't have a BAA for that, we weren't in a position to rapidly adopt it. So we're looking forward to this area in particular getting some attention to be able to make it much more efficient. You know, Epic CareLink is one option, but unfortunately, at least at the implementation at our institution, there's only a 2-year limit to the look back on the data, and many of these audits in particular were for studies that have been open for much longer and needed a longer time frame of look back. So there are some limitations with some of the technologies, even though they appear to be, you know, potential solutions. Finally, we have some new challenges ahead of us, in particular from a staffing perspective. It's called the Great Resignation of 2021. It's hitting every industry. But what we're seeing is that it's dramatically impacting our clinical research staff. They are leaving the medical centers across the country at staggering rates, in part because they are having salary competition with industry, in part because of the lifestyle changes that the pandemic has brought on for families, remote work, as well as some of the mandatory vaccination requirements of medical centers and concerns, especially for younger women of reproductive age with respect to the vaccine. And we are having a very difficult time hiring temps and rehiring for these positions. So this is really going to have a major impact, yet again, a sort of a second wave of impact on clinical trial accruals across the country. Finally, I'd like to just bring up some happy lessons learned. And this is not necessarily from the cancer clinical trials perspective, but from the rapid, I would say even ultra rapid activation of COVID-19 therapeutic studies. We were able to open full therapeutic interventional COVID studies within 7 to 10 days. This required us to have near real-time IRB approval, with IRB meetings 2 to 3 times per week, including the weekends, reviewers meeting 2 to 3 times per week, including weekends, and the sponsors being just as responsive. If we were all collaborating and working in real time and not stressing over the minor details of the language in a contract or details of a budget, we could get a lot of studies open really quickly. And the reality is that the goal was just to get the studies open to try to save lives and not everyone just covering their butt. So with that in mind, I think we can summarize that a great deal can be accomplished when we are working together, all rowing in the same direction. We can get a lot done. Rapid change is possible in clinical research, not an area that you usually think of as the word rapid with, due to its historically slow nature with the heavy regulation. But this concept of study startup sprints between local institutions and sponsors could be a new, highly effective way for study activation. Is there a way we can replicate this process? And finally, we do need to be very aware of the workforce challenges that the clinical research community is facing right now. It was difficult pre-pandemic, but I would say we're at a crisis level today. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Hello, I'm Jane Perlmutter, and as you can see, I'm a long-term cancer survivor and an active research advocate, and I'm going to talk about this topic from that perspective. First, I really want to provide a little bit of context and sort of talk about the pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID several attributes. The public awareness of clinical trials is quite limited prior to COVID, but during COVID, there was so much discussion about health and vaccine clinical trials that awareness increased, and hopefully those will continue post-COVID. Likewise, there was very limited awareness of the huge health disparities in our country. Much more awareness because of COVID, and hopefully actions that will ameliorate those disparities post-COVID. Cancer clinical trials were heavily reliant on academic hospitals prior to COVID, but during COVID, the goal was to keep patients out of hospitals. So sometime early on, they were suspended, or at least some of the aspects of bringing patients to the hospitals were limited, and we'll talk more about that. Many patients have been talking for a long time about distributing clinical trials more broadly, and that hopefully is one of the benefits and learnings from COVID. Likewise, prior to COVID, a lot of cancer clinical trials were heavily research focused. Some of those non-critical components were eliminated during COVID, again, to keep patients out of hospitals. And perhaps in the future, we'll focus more on really impacting the treatment rather than just research that maybe could be done in other ways. As you know, prior to COVID, accrual to cancer clinical trials was quite limited to maybe 5% of adults. Initially, it was really slowed during COVID, but I believe now it's about where it was prior, and hopefully we'll learn some things, have more patient-friendly trials, and there'll be even more accrual following COVID. I want to turn now to the Reach to Recovery initiative that ASCO started in May 2020 and actually has published on in this publication in January 2021. I was fortunate enough to be part of their work group, and I want to summarize a few of the key findings. I'm going to focus on the first two goals of this project, which are really those that are patient-focused, making trials more accessible, affordable, and equitable, and also more pragmatic. This slide captures some of the key recommendations from the report, only limited ones. And along the left-hand column are components of clinical trials in a more or less sequential fashion, really from the patient's perspective. And then in the rest of the chart, we talk about some attributes of these trials that were changed during COVID and some of the benefits of those changes, as well as perhaps some of the challenges. We don't have time to go into all of this in detail, but I do want to highlight a couple of things. One is that a number of the changes should help diversity. They certainly will help patient convenience. But there are challenges, some of which are related to providing technology for patients that might not have technology, and others that might be related to financial transfers that will make some people resistant to implementing these kinds of trials. The bottom line is that these recommendations all are related to making trials more distributed and also more pragmatic. And in this slide, I kind of summarize what I mean by pragmatic trials. And if you are not familiar with the PRECIS 2, I recommend you take a look at it. You can see that there are 9 dimensions of pragmatism. And the ones that I've circled in red are the ones that are most relevant to patients. A couple of misunderstandings about pragmatic trials that I'd like to kind of allay in the next slide. First of all, pragmatic trials are not all or none. As we saw, there are 9 different dimensions, and there's varying levels on each of those dimensions. So I think the key message I'd like to make is think about each dimension and where it's reasonable to be more or less pragmatic, and don't feel like it's either all or none. Secondly, pragmatic trials are not biased. They're not observational studies. They can include randomization, and I think it's important to keep that in mind. A lot of people don't seem to recognize that. On the other hand, they are likely to increase error variance, and that may well require more participants in the trials, but that does not make them biased. If they're more patient-friendly, even though they might require more patients, they may well accrue more rapidly, which would keep the costs down. They're especially well suited to establishing effectiveness, which may be, but they could be less relevant for registration trials. But that really raises my next question. What is the value of a treatment that's efficacious but not effective? And we should recognize that most patients, most of the public, really does not make this distinction. They think of clinical research as establishing the effectiveness of trials. In fact, they think these two words are synonymous. We know that in the drug development arena, this is really not true. So I ask you the question, what is the value of a treatment that's efficacious but not effective? And my answer is that for the drug companies, they're quite valuable. They are profitable, but for patients, they're really not valuable at all. And you might claim that it's a necessary but not sufficient condition to be efficacious. But I don't think we need to make that in-between step and establish first the efficaciousness, because particularly when there are small effects, the translation is not really all that likely. So I thank you, and by way of summary, I would encourage you to be flexible, be innovative, be thoughtful. Don't jeopardize patient safety or scientific integrity, but don't go back. Build better, back better. Thank you.
Hi, this is Jim Dorshow from the National Cancer Institute. It's my pleasure to review with you the effect of the COVID-19 pandemic on the NCI's clinical trials program over the last year, year and a half. Next slide. As everyone knows, COVID-19 has had a major impact on clinical trials across the United States and across the world. For the NCI, the presence of the pandemic was an enormous roadblock to accrual. It required us to change our informed consent procedures. It was necessary to change how we handle in-person visits to receive investigational drugs. There were problems with in-person assessments of patient safety and study adherence, and a real problem with the exclusive use of imaging and laboratory facilities specified by trial documents when patients did not want to come to the hospital. Clearly, there was also an issue related to the collection of low-grade adverse events, despite the fact that some of those things had very little to do with the clinical relevance of the study endpoints. And we had a lot to consider about whether these were really required. Among the most important issues was a limited access of patients to cancer care facilities and the reprogramming of clinical research resources to clinical care away from clinical research. And overall, there was just limited availability of facilities for underserved patient populations to access clinical trials. Next slide. Beginning in late February, early March, the NCI began a rapid response program to try to deal with these major pandemic issues. We changed to the use of electronic patient consenting. We began to change our contracts so that we could very rapidly provide oral investigational agents directly to patients. We initiated electronic rather than in-person study audits. And we clearly made it obvious to our investigators that telemedicine visits would be acceptable. We tried to limit the impact of minor study deviations on trial conduct and evaluation. And we implemented a major program to decentralize testing for required laboratory and imaging studies. And along this entire clinical pathway, trying to deal with the pandemic, during 2020, we conducted a new strategic planning exercise to try to deal with not only the pandemic, but also how we ought to think about clinical trials going forward. Next slide. I'd like to take this chance over the next couple slides to review with you the direct effect of the pandemic on the accrual to interventional clinical trials. On this slide, you have the accrual to the NCI's National Clinical Trials Network. And as you see in light blue, beginning the last week of February and then on to the first 2 weeks of March, there was a tremendous drop in patient accrual to therapeutic trials. That decrease was approximately by 50%, and it lasted for weeks. And really, you can look from the nadir of the accrual in late March. It required roughly 4 to 6 months for us to get back to overall levels of patient accrual that we had seen in the past in 2019. As you can see in red, thankfully, over the course of 2021, our accrual has been steady and equivalent to 2019 levels in the NCTN. Next slide. The NCI collects data in addition from the NCTN, also from our NCI designated cancer centers. And we get quarterly reports of their accrual, not just to NCTN trials, but to all of the other kinds of trials that go on at those centers. And so in this figure, you see the accrual for 2020 in green versus 2019 to cancer center, institutional, and externally peer-reviewed trials. So these are all the studies that go on at the NCI designated cancer centers in aggregate on a month-by-month basis. But it excludes the NCTN accrual, and it excludes pharmaceutical accrual. And so over that same time point, a major decrease, again, by over 50% in accrual. But what I'd like to point out on this slide is that here we are in December of 2020, and this goes on into 2021. There is still at least a 20 to 25% decrease in accrual. That is to say that by the time the NCTN accrual was back up to pre-COVID levels, accrual to other trials, investigator-initiated trials, and peer-reviewed trials other than the NCTN had not fully recovered. Next slide. We can look at this at a little more depth of the kind of accrual at the cancer centers that has recovered and has not recovered. So in red, you can see that we're basically back to pre-COVID levels in the early phase trials, phase 1 and early phase 2. But in purple, you see that the major decrement in accrual at cancer centers, apart from the NCTN and apart from pharma accrual, were the late phase 2 studies that and some phase 3 trials that the cancer centers accrue at their own institutions. Next slide. If you look at the overall aggregate year to year, so this is on a yearly basis rather than on a weekly or monthly or quarterly basis, what you can see is that for 2020, for the year as a whole, there was approximately a 25% decrease in accrual. That accrual spanned the entire spectrum from pharmaceutical trials to investigator-initiated trials that were externally peer-reviewed to the large number of investigator-initiated studies that institutions conduct using philanthropic monies or other monies. A major change over the course of 2020 that we think has not quite gotten back up to where it should be over the past few months. Next slide. So in sum, there was a major impact in the second and third quarters on treatment trial accrual, not only to NCTN trials, but to investigator-initiated, grant-funded, and industrially sponsored trials at NCI-designated cancer centers. And while the NCTN trial accrual appears to have recovered, the trial accrual in other categories has not fully recovered. And clearly, this extends to pharma-sponsored trials at the NCI-designated cancer centers as well. Next slide. So I'd just like to conclude by telling the audience a little bit about what the outcome of our clinical trials strategic planning exercise has been, and how the impact of that exercise, the impact of the pandemic on that exercise. And so we will be organizing a whole series of implementation objectives over the next year to 2 years that focus on streamlining clinical trial accrual, trying to limit clinical trial data collection in late phase trials. Some of the things that we've learned from the pandemic we think will be essential to making it easier to do clinical trials and accrue over the coming years. We're very interested in trying to not only extract clinical trial data from electronic health records, but to insert investigational data and orders for investigational trials into EHRs, a major effort that we think that is really important to further identify procedures, including informed consenting and auditing, that we modified due to COVID-19 that can be performed locally, and that really can be adopted as part of standard clinical trial practice. We want to continue the expansion of telehealth in clinical trials, including telehealth for enrollment, consenting, and study visits. And broadly, we want to enhance access to trials and utilize what we've learned in terms of making trials more streamlined to access a larger number of patients in rural communities and in underserved communities by broadening eligibility requirements to really advance clinical trial objectives over the coming years. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Fareed Melhem, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the impact of COVID-19 on clinical studies as we've seen at Metadata. So as a quick introduction, I'm the Senior Vice President and Head of Acorn AI Labs at Metadata. In my role, I focus on the application of data and analytics to improve the design and execution of clinical studies. I've also led Metadata's analysis of the impact of COVID-19 on clinical trials and the industry response. To get started, let me share a little bit of what we saw in our data at Metadata, which covers a broad swath of the industry's trials. As we're all aware, COVID-19 had a significant effect on clinical trials as many study starts were delayed, patients had trouble maintaining visits, and monitors were not able to get to sites. Data, we saw enrollment rates decline between 50 and 80% by April of 2020, 30% or more increases in missed visits, and source data verification rates dropped to nearly zero in April as monitors were not able to get to site. Obviously, that has a tremendous impact on patients, on investigators, and on the conduct of studies as well. We also asked investigators what they were seeing on the ground through a survey that we ran throughout last year. Here are some of the results of that. Looking at the top first, we see the impact in terms of the ability to run studies. 30% of investigators reported having studies delayed, and 40% had to halt recruiting for at least some of their studies. We also saw a tremendous change, though, in terms of a number of initiatives put in place to enable patients to continue with their studies. So 1/3 of investigators reported extending visit windows, 30% reported move to virtual visits for at least some of their trials, and over a quarter reported a shift in shipping product direct to patients. These changes, which were all placed quite rapidly to react to the impact of the pandemic, helped keep patients safe, helped maintain study conduct, and also taught us a lot about how data and technology can help support trials going forward. So, where are we today? What we're looking at here is the number of new patients entering clinical trials compared to a baseline of 2019, which is indexed at 100. The green line is all indications, and the blue line is oncology specifically. Throughout the pandemic, we saw oncology outperform other indications in terms of the ability to continue to recruit patients and continue to maintain visits. But like all other spaces, oncology did take a significant hit. The good news is that starting in the back half of last year and continuing through this year, we did see significant progress in terms of the number of patients who are able to enter clinical studies. In fact, we saw a jump above the baseline in September of 2020. That was likely due to a backlog of patients looking to get into trials. And since then, we've seen rises and declines due in part to resurgence of case rates, but also partially due to normal seasonality. And in recent months, we have seen continued strong accrual of patients in studies overall and in oncology studies in particular. A lot of this comes down to the response from public health officials and the communities in various countries. It is also driven by the rapid response from the industry, from regulators, and from investigators and sites to expand the use of technology and rethink the way that they deliver studies for patients during COVID. Let me share a little bit of what we saw in that respect. So when we think about rethinking trials from a data and technology perspective, we can break it down into three major buckets. The first is the use of data and analytics to assess the changing situation and really agilely adjust. The first thing that the industry broadly needed when the pandemic struck was information to understand where patients were able to get to visits, where sites were online, where they were offline, and how data quality was changing. Things were changing extremely rapidly, and frankly, most internal systems and processes in clinical studies are not set up to react that quickly. So a lot of the work that we did over, April, May, and through the rest of last year was to set up systems to allow that sort of real-time visibility into what's happening in trials. And we have really seen that stick as sponsors continue to try to enable more agile understanding of trial conduct and think about where they can adjust in real time. The second area where we saw a huge change was around data capture. So thinking about different ways to capture and integrate patient data. The first of those is, of course, decentralization. We saw a large move towards decentralization of trials, including increases in the use of e-consent and e-COA, as well as significant increases in televisits. Interesting is that by and large, this is not new technology. This is stuff that we have had for a while and been piloting in various ways. What's different here is that we're simply using it as an industry, and I'm optimistic that it will continue. The flip approach as well is to think about what data needs to be collected from the patient in the course of the clinical trial and what data can be collected from other sources. For example, synthetic control arms, which use data from historical trials, can be used to minimize the number of new patients that need to be recruited into a control arm. And this year, we've seen a marked increase in the use of synthetic control arms, likely due to more comfort with the approach, but also some of the precedents that we've seen set over the last 18 months. And then the last area I'll touch on here is tokenization, which is another burgeoning space. This ability to link clinical trial data with real-world data at the patient level opens up a number of avenues to better understand both clinical and real-world outcomes and to enable longer-term follow-up. And we've seen a big increase in interest and some deployment of that as well. The last area I'll mention is the real effort we saw around maintaining quality and supply. With monitors unable to get to sites, biopharma had to rethink how to manage data quality. And they deployed a number of solutions through analytics and risk-based approaches, but as well as through things like remote source review, so allowing monitors to do their job without actually physically being on sites. And we've seen those continue as well. All these components have been deployed out of necessity, really, over the last 18 months, and we've learned a lot about both the capability of the technology, but also about the underlying process. The big question now is, will they stick? How will we ensure they work at scale? I'd say so far, we're getting good signals that many of the approaches to decentralization will stick. Some of the urgency, frankly, may be waning. For example, some technologies that we've seen added to protocols really overnight last year are now being pushed back into pilot mode. And to some degree, that's okay as we continue to figure out what works and how they work and what the impact is. But we also have to be diligent to build on the progress and insights gained over the last half of last year and into the beginning of this year as well. And I hope we will as an industry. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dietmar Berger, and I'm the Global Head of Development and Chief Medical Officer at Sanofi. Today, it is my pleasure to speak on behalf of TransCelerate Biopharma about the challenges and opportunities for our industry posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. For all of us, whether in clinical practice or clinical trials, the COVID-19 pandemic challenged how we can deliver care to patients. However, this disruption also came with opportunity as it required both our industry as well as regulatory authorities and our partners in healthcare to think about new ways of working. I want to speak about some of these opportunities and learnings for the future, which we have also summarized in a TransCelerate white paper on the modernization of clinical trials. To provide some background, TransCelerate is a not-for-profit organization created in 2012 to foster collaboration across research and development in our industry. 20 sponsor organizations are currently members of TransCelerate, working together to optimize the way how we conduct clinical trials, with the objective to improve outcomes for patients. During the COVID pandemic, TransCelerate convened a working group to explore and identify solutions that could be beneficial as the ecosystem pivots into a new norm. Overall, the group analyzed 55 unique case studies from the member organizations, each a specific example of a technology, a process, or a method implemented to assure the continuity of clinical trials during COVID-19. I want to share some of the insights into the challenges and opportunities resulting from altered ways of trial conduct during the pandemic, some of the lessons learned and recommendations to modernize clinical trial conduct in the future. Here you have some of the key challenges we all faced during the pandemic, summarized on this slide. They include, first and foremost, a lack of harmonization across global health authorities, as well as gaps in connectivity and integration across the clinical trial landscape. Global privacy laws and ethics concerns always have to be considered, and patient preferences and burden need to be better understood when thinking about trial conduct and different measures that we can apply, for example, remote monitoring, etc. And finally, change management is needed and was required also during the pandemic for sponsors, for vendors, for sites and participants to transition to and accept these remote and digital solutions that we wanted to apply. And this represents a need for a true cultural shift in data generation and processing. There are clear lessons learned, and applying those learnings in the post-COVID era represents an opportunity for modernization of the clinical trial landscape. These include the deployment of more flexible protocols, for example, with regards to pandemic preparedness, trial continuity, and functional planning, which all can be anticipated. Also, digital data collection tools, remote monitoring, and initiatives that move the trial to the patient have to be developed and implemented proactively. This requires a clear identification of the critical data, adequate contingency planning, as well as training for study teams, sites, participants, and other stakeholders. Key success factors involved a change in mindset on one side with a focus on creative and flexible solutions, close collaboration between all stakeholders, and then the joint recognition of potential benefits for patients and stakeholders. Also, a focus on trial execution and continuity is required, utilizing digital and remote data collection tools as well as principles of risk-based monitoring. Utilizing these approaches at Sanofi, for example, we were able to maintain more than 95% of the patients within our ongoing studies, and we were able to start the vast majority of our new studies with a maximum delay of 3 to 6 months, even during the height of the pandemic. So in conclusion, COVID-19 really had a catalyzing effect on our industry, and it forced us to think about ways to improve clinical trial conduct, not only during the pandemic itself, but also for the future. We had previously asked ourselves the question of why change clinical trials, but we're now asking ourselves, why even go back, especially if there's no additional risk to data integrity and to patient safety. Obviously, there is a need for global regulatory harmonization, and I believe we have all come to a change in perspective with regards to the risk and benefits of clinical trial modernization and innovation. To me, and I'm speaking here on behalf of Transcelerate, a key lesson from the pandemic is that radical change and modernization of trial conduct is possible as long as it is driven by collaboration and partnership across the entire clinical trial ecosystem. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sandeep Agarwal. I'm a medical oncologist at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and I'll be discussing clinical cancer research during the COVID-19 pandemic from an FDA perspective. There have been several regulatory challenges to clinical trial conduct during the pandemic. In ensuring the safety of trial participants, it's imperative that patients are informed of changes and receive adequate informed consent. Evaluating safety using alternative methods has been used more widely during this time, and in some instances, safety evaluations were delayed or omitted altogether. There have also been challenges to maintaining trial and data integrity. For example, changes to assessments that are the basis of formal hypothesis testing will affect interpretation of efficacy. Interpreting missing data and understanding reasons for protocol deviations also continue to be challenges. The FDA has issued multiple guidance documents related to COVID-19. Perhaps the most recognizable to this audience is the guidance on clinical trial conduct. Here, ensuring the safety of trial participants is paramount. This was true before the pandemic and remains true now. The document provides guidance on most common issues and also advises sponsors to contact the FDA on certain specific issues relating to trial conduct. Some common issues addressed include using alternative site methods such as remote monitoring. It notes that changes to protect patients can be implemented without prior IRB or FDA approval if the potential hazard is immediate, but are still required to be reported afterwards. COVID therapies, such as vaccines and other products received under expanded use access, should not necessarily exclude patients from trials, and contingency measures undertaken during the pandemic should be documented, such as how restrictions caused by COVID led to changes, who was impacted, and how. There are several aspects of clinical trials and evidence generation that should warrant consulting the FDA Review Division. We recommend consulting the FDA when protocol modifications are related to efficacy endpoints, particularly those that are important for assessments that are the basis of formal hypothesis testing. For example, disparities in lab measurements or imaging protocols will introduce variability and can affect type 1 and type 2 error rates. We recommend sponsors also consult the agency where there are certain changes to data management and or the statistical analysis plan. For example, before locking a database, the SAP should address how deviations related to COVID will be handled in the analysis. These are a few examples of issues that are key to maintaining trial integrity and reliable evidence generation. Let's look at an example of the pandemic potentially affecting efficacy endpoints. Progression-free survival, or PFS, is a commonly used efficacy endpoint in randomized cancer clinical trials. In this example, PFS is being assessed every 8 weeks with imaging studies. At 16 weeks, the patient's scan does not show progression. The patient actually progresses at the 18-week mark. Since the actual time of progression is in between scans, progression will only be documented at the scan at 24 weeks. This is acceptable when imaging assessments have been prospectively defined and are the same in both arms of a randomized trial. But if there's variability in remote imaging assessments, these could include missing or out-of-window assessments. If this is well balanced, the variability may reduce the power to see a difference. More concerning, however, is if there's an asymmetry between arms that could lead to a false conclusion. For example, if there are more delays or missing assessments in the control arm compared to the investigational arm, or vice versa, this will introduce bias into the assessment of PFS. This hasn't been a major issue noted to date, but it is certainly a possibility and just one example of something we must account for. Let's consider another example, this time assessing safety. When assessing adverse events in person versus via telemedicine, there may be differences in reporting. Findings on physical exam may prompt additional inquiry and will better inform a review of systems. Assessing toxicity without a physical exam to accompany the history may decrease reported adverse events. On the other hand, telemedicine could allow caregivers to more readily join the visit and participate, and they may point out side effects they noted in their loved one that the patient themselves did not initially note, increasing reports of toxicity. There's always going to be some variability in these regards, whether these assessments are made in person or remotely. The point is that there's now going to be the potential for increased variability. And if there's asymmetry or imbalance between arms, bias will result and will confound interpretation of the safety profile. So it's important, though, to see these variabilities be relatively uniform across arms. In learning from COVID-19, all stakeholders have a responsibility to evaluate the data generated during COVID-19 to characterize the effects of remote trial conduct on clinical trial data. The FDA's Oncology Center of Excellence is dedicated to working with the community to generate insights here in advancing trial modifications and in facilitating aspects of decentralized trials. And trial initiation for COVID-related products that were expedited and the procedures that were used to achieve this speed should be reviewed and the aspects carried forward where appropriate. We're particularly interested in learning more about aspects such as the effect of remote lab and imaging assessments, telemedicine visits, and remote investigational product administration, to name a few. When we think about trial modernization, it's important to note that these efforts were underway before the pandemic, and these efforts will continue to be better informed by evaluating data generated during the pandemic. Areas of interest include incorporating technology to reduce patient burden, using non-trial sites, imaging centers, and drug administration, and minimizing collection of non-essential data. But the ability to incorporate these aspects moving forward will depend on maintaining patient safety and maintaining data and trial integrity. Lastly, I want to touch on broadening inclusion on clinical trials and addressing disparities. Healthcare disparities have been highlighted by the COVID-19 pandemic. There continues to be an underrepresentation of racial and ethnic minorities in oncology clinical trials. And to promote broadening inclusion and to reduce disparities, representation should be addressed throughout a drug's development. The decentralized trials may expand access to broader patient populations, and real-world data may be useful to obtain additional information on underrepresented populations. So to conclude, the FDA continues to promote flexibility in trial conduct if the safety of trial participants is maintained and data and trial integrity are not compromised. Broadening inclusion on trials is a priority. Efforts to learn from the pandemic are ongoing, and what we learn will better inform trial modernization efforts. And in modernizing trials, it's important that we prioritize the modifications that provide the biggest benefit to patients, the most efficiencies to investigators, and have the least effect on data quality. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. We really appreciate these excellent presentations. I wanted to make sure that everyone who's listening to this session and who has heard all the talks, feel free to add questions in the chat box. We will be addressing those, and we will have questions for each of the panel members, as well as those that are come in from the outside. So many thanks to everyone. Now, let me start the ball rolling by asking someone, anyone on the panel can take this question. Maybe Dr. Levy will take a shot at it, but we've heard, at least at the NCI, in discussions with members of our advisory committees, that in fact, there's already an issue of recidivism, that we're snapping back to old ways of doing business. I'm interested in everybody's opinion and their own personal experience along those lines, because it really is an issue of the utmost importance to try to learn as much as we can from our trials.
No, I'll go ahead and take a stab at that, Jim. So I would say that there is a little bit of I'd like to, Nancy put it, the Band-Aid snapping back to where we were before. I would say certainly remote visits are still being conducted where the state line issues are not a factor, so that has continued. Remote monitoring has continued. But I would say that where I had hoped that we would see improvements in our clinical trials startup processes, I would say that we're back to our old conservative ways with respect to study startup timelines and legal processes. And that's one area I really wish we could take those lessons learned forward from our peer study startup processes with the COVID clinical trials and begin to feel the same sense of urgency with our cancer clinical trials as we did with those.
This is Jane Perlmutter. I would reinforce what I hear from Mia, that there is some snapping back, and we should be proactive in avoiding that. And I'd like to turn this back to Jim Dorshaw. As NCI is developing new trials, are they considering actually incorporating some of the recommendations from the Road to Recovery, for example, into the new protocols?
Yes, indeed. So many of there's a very significant overlap between the implementation recommendations from our Clinical Trials Advisory Committee white paper from a year and a half ago and the ASCO publication. And I think that one of the advantages, if you will, of the public system is that where there are trials that are not IND driven, so that trials using commercially available agents, we can not only institute these changes that seem to be working, but also we can investigate what those trials have done to data quality, to startup times, to various kinds of flexibility issues. We can actually run trials or arms of trials to understand what these changes actually mean. Because I really do think that if we're going to try to understand what's gone on the last year and a half, having additional data done in a formalized way would be extremely useful for trying to institutionalize many of the things that all of us have tried to do and have done successfully. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes,
building on this discussion, Farid Melvin and Dietmar Berger, you have provided us, well, the whole session, but you with both of you with data that we've faced the biggest change in the modern clinical trial conduct for patients, but that the changes that were implemented were not because all of a sudden somebody invented a new technology. All of a sudden the FDA changed all of their regulations, because Sandeep really clearly told us we adapted to it. Most of them were existing allowances, not new ones. We were just not taking advantage of them. So I think the key to the point is that we were forced to change in an industry that, or a way of doing something, which is clinical trials, that would not have done it by itself. So now we're discussing how do we maintain this change. So it would be great to hear from both of your perspectives of which are the main limiting steps in the data collection and processing and in the industry conduct of trials that are limiting maintaining the change.
I'm happy to start on that one. I think one thing that's important to remember, right, is this was all done very quickly, and really a lot of it, frankly, by a lot of people's sweat and brute force. And I think Mia talked about that a little bit. So those rapid study startups that we saw with COVID trials, a lot of that was people working 7 days a week. And we just are not kind of equipped to do that at scale yet at this point. And I think that's true for a number of the ways that the technology were implemented. It doesn't mean that those technologies don't work at scale. They certainly do, but a lot of processes around were built kind of in real time, right? And so I think a little bit of what we're seeing here is that need for, how do we do this process at scale, and some of the thinking around that that is going on in the industry right now, combined with, frankly, I think we're seeing more study starts right now than we have in quite a while, given the backlog of last year. It's just a lot, right? And so, this is where I am optimistic that we'll get there, and that technology can play a major role, right? As we continue to harden some of these processes and really understand what works, the technology can help with that scale, and we can move away from people, frankly, doing this 7 days a week to technology being a big part of it.
Yeah, and I agree. Scale is definitely one of the questions, right? And how do we translate this into the future, and how can we make sure that we can apply it on a broader basis? I think the other component is during the beginning of the pandemic, when we started especially the COVID-related studies, there was no alternative, right? We needed those studies to start quickly. We needed to have the possibility for remote monitoring. You know, regulatory authorities turned things around very, very quickly. We needed to get the drug to the patient, et cetera, et cetera. And there was just no alternative. I think as we move forward, right, the kind of the old ways of doing things are still possible, and we need to think about, you know, how can we demonstrate the benefits of the new ways of working, and it also came up during these presentations. How can we make sure that we do remote visits, that we do risk-based monitoring, that we change our study startup procedures, but then at the same time really make sure that trial integrity, trial quality, the reporting, for example, of adverse events really lives up to the same expectations. So there will be some questions about how can we generate data, how can we look at those data together, and how can we take decisions about implementing these activities also in the future. And that's where I think collaborations come in, collaborations like, you know, with Transcelerate, collaborations, you know, with regulatory authorities. We really need to look at these factors and try and learn and see, you know, in the interest of patients, what's the best path forward.
May I ask a question of Sandeep? Because this is an issue that we confronted, and I think that great credit is due the FDA for making many accommodations in a relatively quick way. And I know that we had many interactions with the Oncology Center of Excellence to try to allow us to change NCI procedures. But one of the things that I think remains a great difficulty, and I'm not sure that there's an easy way around it, but I'm just interested in your perspective, is that while we got rapid assent to the ability for the NCI to send oral IND drugs to local sites and to develop procedures to do that that met the requirements for the trials under IND. Clearly, there are still a fair number of intravenous agents that are investigational. And that, to the best of my knowledge, is not yet a way around the requirement for the patients to come to the site that has the investigational drug pharmacy and delivers an IV drug. We haven't really developed a way around that requirement. Do you have any thoughts, or I don't know if you folks are discussing that, but it is an issue that we've had lots of questions on for our trials.
Yeah, thanks for that question. It is a challenge, I think, because of the heterogeneity and the variability in the types of intravenous medications that are being evaluated in clinical trials. Certainly, it's something that's more reasonable to do for a drug that already, for instance, has approval in other settings and has a pre-existing safety database where you kind of know what you're getting maybe when you administer at an off-site, compared to a therapy that doesn't have as well elucidated of a safety profile, or does but may require urgent interventions like a CAR T-cell therapy or something of that sense. Because of that variability, there's no one-size-fits-all approach, and that's been one of the challenges in trying to figure out how to do this. I think it certainly can be done for certain drugs, but probably those that have the safety profile and more experience to start.
Thanks, Sandeep, for this discussion. There are two questions in the public chat that are both can be addressed to my co-moderator, Jim Dorshaw. So the first one is from Kelly Linhart, who's asking, are there plans to collect data on patients who had a COVID-19 diagnosis and then had a diagnosis of cancer? So although it isn't strictly the subject of this session, I can just remind you, earlier this morning I was on a conference call with the steering committee for our NCAP study, which is a large prospective trial of patients with cancer patients who develop COVID-19, to look longitudinally at their natural history and to look at the immunological effects that are associated with the combination of active cancer treatment and COVID-19. It's clear
from the outset that we know we've gotten a lot of data to understand how COVID-19 affects clinical practice and how and treatment. What we don't know yet is exactly the interaction between the infection and treatment on the immunological parameters that control recovery from the COVID-19, T-cell mediated immunity, antibody response, et cetera. And so that's all in process. We're very interested in doing that.
That's an outstanding effort from the NCI, and we'll all learn a lot about it. So the second question for you, Jim, was that you stated that the NCI has the ability to prospectively learn about the effects of clinical trial modifications. Can you expand on specifically which ones?
Well, to me, you know, this really relates to several issues that have been discussed already, and that is to say, how do you know that the changes we made did not adversely affect the quality of the trials or the measurement of the outcomes? And we've talked about that a little bit. And to me, you know, we can do retrospective analyses. And in fact, my clinical colleagues are in CTEP are doing just that, to look at various outcome measures that we collect in electronic audits and so on and so forth. But the best way, from my mind, to do this is to actually take it upon us to expand some randomized trials by adding arms. Can we understand whether or not you really can dramatically change eligibility requirements, kidney function, liver function, et cetera? What does that do to quality of the data that you generate? Can you expand eligibility? Can we collect less data in non-IND trials? Will that affect, how will that affect the outcomes that we measure or that are the desired? I think that many things, at least my opinion is that, and this is subject to prospective evaluation, is that we do many things because we've always done them. It may well be that historical precedent turns out to be the correct way to do things, but it's never been subjected to any kind of prospective evaluation. And I think that in the context of drugs about which we know a lot, and you know that the NCI does lots of trials where we're looking to change practice for established practice therapies, we can address those questions. And I'm eager to try to do that over the coming year or two or three with the help of the chairs of the NCTN.
Which will be great to get Jane's comments on this, because you're talking about adding prospectively testing what we all think that is the truth, which is we could do with more decentralized clinical trial conduct, more patient-centric, and we're having less interventions that are not guided to the primary endpoint of the trial, or why we're doing the study, why are we testing this drug to treat this cancer, why are we doing all these other things in the way of doing that. So Jane, it would be great to get your comments. You already touched on this on your presentation.
Yeah, I think it'll be great to have those data, and certainly NCI is a great place to get them. But we also have to recognize that there will be some trade-offs. For example, NCI, FDA, and others have pushed, and that we are seeing different changes in eligibility requirements. There are some downsides to that. Probably some of the trials are going to have to be bigger, but the upsides, I think we have now all agreed, are worth it. And I think a few of the changes, even if we find that there are some losses, might be things we want to consider doing anyway.
Could I just kind of push this a little further and ask Dr. Berger or to comment on whether or not Sanofi has seen evidence that doing things electronically, doing data audits, if you will, based on your databases, do you have any evidence so far, based on your experience, that this has changed trial quality?
Actually, we don't, right? We looked at that more specifically, but I have to say it is an effort to really make sure that you maintain quality. So for example, if you take the trial to the patient, more often than not, we employ a home nursing service or a service that really goes to the patient's home and works with the patient to obtain like the same quality of information. What we have seen is definitely a move towards more diversity, more complete capture also of patient populations as you bring the trial to them, which I believe is another opportunity as you find more patients that are, you know, let's say less mobile, they're less able to come to the site, that they're also from different diverse groups of patients. So, but to your specific question, we have not seen a gap in quality at this point, but I also want to say it's an ongoing assessment.
Sandeep might want to comment on this, because I know FDA has been pushing for quite a while on more risk-based monitoring, and feeling that there's a lot of monitoring and data capture that really are not beneficial, and and they've seen some resistance in pharmaceutical companies to cut back on some of that.
Yeah, so we have published a few guidance documents on this, and this also does predate the pandemic. You know, as far back as February 2016, there was a guidance published on how to determine the extent of safety data collection needed for late-stage pre-market and post-approval clinical investigations. There's a guidance on risk-based approaches as well. So certainly something that we've advocated for where relevant. I think from the regulatory standpoint, some of the key issues, again, in discussing kind of the context, is looking at things from the standpoint of the disease setting. You know, patients who are receiving therapies on trials in a metastatic incurable setting are going to have a different risk tolerance than those receiving an investigational agent on perhaps an adjuvant trial. You know, there's also just whether there's a pre-existing safety database and the size of that really matters. But it is certainly something that we have provided guidance on and would like to see more. But, you know, I think one of the difficulties here, and maybe someone else on the panel can comment on, is there is an additional layer of complexity here, because we are seeing a lot of global cancer trials where the regulatory requirements you know, are different across the globe for the same trial, and that may certainly be a limitation to the adoption of this.
Dietmar, do you want to address that last comment?
Yeah, I think it's a really important comment, because when we're trying to develop a new medicine, obviously we're doing that on a global basis, and as you know, the pandemic situation can be very different when you look at let's say North America, South America, or then even compared to Europe or compared to China, and the status of, you know, how regulatory authorities look at those studies, what kind of requirements they have, can be very different. And obviously we're getting different feedback from different authorities at times, and we just have to see what is the best path forward then for global development. And I have to say here that obviously FDA has been very forward-looking, has been actually very supportive of the modernization of studies and the newer methods. I cannot say that for every regulatory authority around the globe there's just a different status, and sometimes we have to resort to a bit more conservative approaches in some areas because we want to develop for patients around the globe. It hasn't been a major hurdle during the pandemic, I have to say, but we have to see how that develops in the future, and whether those more modern approaches can really be developed, and also for global drug development.
I want to go back to something that Mia Levy touched upon on her presentation at the beginning of this session, which is it's an example of one of the limitations to maintaining remote conduct of clinical trials, and mostly remote monitoring, which is the ability for auditors and monitors to access medical records from a healthcare system and be able to review specific patients in a clinical trial and not have access to everything else that healthcare system has. And this becomes very contentious because there's litigation about accessing unwanted access of medical records. So this merges an issue on technology, regulation, legislation, and contracting. It would be great to get more of your explanation of the problem, maybe Farid Melhem being able to think of what are potential solutions.
Thank you for that question. So, you know, as we've heard many times, the technologies that were implemented during the pandemic existed before the pandemic. They just hadn't been implemented at a scale that that we saw during that time, and we finally all had the motivation to adopt technology of various different kinds, from electronic consent to the virtual visits and the electronic audit in particular. We have experimented with all of the different technologies that I listed. In the end, we even had the vendor community coming out to us and even sponsors saying, oh, we'd like you to use this technology. And we said, well, we don't have a business associate agreement with that particular vendor, so we can't. But the challenge has become that we've literally had, for almost every single study with almost every single sponsor, 3 or 4 different ways in which we could do it. We have settled on a few, including Dropbox and Microsoft Teams, and even secure remote, secure transfer of files. The unfortunate reality is that, unfortunately, the Epic electronic health record system that we use does have the ability to offer remote access to the electronic health record for a select number of patients, but it is not as robust as we would have thought compared to those other approaches. It's very surprising to me. And in particular, that 2-year limitation on data accessibility within the medical record, that I don't know if this is something hard coded into our implementation, or if this is sort of just when you get it started, that's how far you can go back. But that limitation has made it very limited for the clinical trials that we already had open, for which we were conducting study audits. I would hope that moving forward, it's not a fixed 2-year limit for every single moment. It would, maybe it was just from 2018, and then it can move forward, and then that technology becomes a possibility. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, I think this is still the Wild West. I don't think we've figured out the best workflows. I think we're doing a lot of workarounds for the audit process. The audit process needs a lot of attention, and certainly would benefit the entire industry if we could get it right.
That all sounds right. I think this a little bit goes back to what I said, right? We were trying a lot of things. There are from a technology point of view, right, a huge number of vendors, both sort of native to healthcare, but also coming from other industries into healthcare, who see an opportunity here, who are trying to stand things up very quickly. So, I think where we will go as we do continue to kind of harden these processes and scale these are to some platforms that can centralize, some of this, and then a sort of best of breed hybrid approach on top of that. And that's kind of a lot of the stuff around Mia was talking about in terms of auditability and document transfer and all the rest of that. But also, we haven't talked about this yet, but as we think about data capture going forward, we are increasingly moving towards additional forms of data being collected into the clinical trial, be those sort of continuous sensor data, a lot more patient reported data, even, EHR to EDC, direct connection, right? So that linkage across those different data sets as they come in is going to be another piece that we will have to solve going forward.
It seems to me there's a lot to be worked in there, because if we collect more data directly from patients, we'll certainly be changing how the reporting of toxicities from clinical trials, which is maybe more accurate, but it may change how the things these drugs are reviewed. And if we collect more patient-directed data, we'll have to adapt to what we do in the medical records, because we may be a discrepancy between what the patient said I felt and what the doctor recorded. That's what happened to the patient. So with this, I would like to go to Sandeep Agarwal. And it's clear that during this process, the FDA has been an enabler to changes, as opposed to a limitation to changes, which many people think that the FDA does, which is not true at all in this case and many other cases. Can the FDA be an enabler of don't go back, which what Jen Palmera said at the end of her presentation, where even if the inertia may be to go back because it's easier to not address all these issues that we're talking about because they're difficult to address, can you make regulations to not go back?
Well, I think it's difficult to be too prescriptive in requiring companies to do certain things. So right now, what we have is we allow that flexibility and we hope that it's adopted, though it is difficult to mandate these things. For example, some things we've done is on the voluntary side is we were asking sponsors now to voluntarily flag individual assessments that have been done remotely versus by trial site, flag assessments for data quality, remote labs and imaging, the timing of when these were done. And then that way we can look at some missing data rates, out of window rates for certain assessments, scan quality, etc. When we have some of this information and we have an idea of what the effect of these changes are on the clinical trial data that was generated during the pandemic, then it's possible that that could inform future guidance and future interactions. But I think in the absence of that information and with the uncertainty, it's difficult to mandate those things at this time.
So in some ways, you're in at least as good a position as NCI to do some of those kind of studies of the impact, and that's great. And I don't think anyone's asking the FDA to mandate. I know they don't like to do that in general, just to maintain the flexibility that they've adopted, at least some of it during COVID.
Right. And that's we do plan to look at that information and hopefully glean some interesting insights from it to help inform how to continue to modernize trials, because trial modernization is a major agency-wide effort pre-pandemic as well as now during the pandemic.
Since we only have a short period of time left, and since so many things changed and appear to have had positive impact, I would like to ask everybody on the panel to take a shot at the following question, and that is, what didn't work? Maybe if everything worked, that's fantastic. But anyone who's ever run a lab knows that not every experiment works. And I'm really interested from across the spectrum of FDA and industry and academia. What things do you think we tried that we should not try to institutionalize going forward?
I think it's a hard question to answer, Jim, because of where what didn't work. Well, we're still 25% below. You told us in your presentation. Even I think Frederick or Dinmar said that we're catching up in oncology trials faster than in other clinical trials, in medicine clinical trials. So quite a bit of things may have worked. But the one thing that worries me from, and Mia Levy touched upon it at the beginning, was we're shifting clinical trials. We're trying to shift clinical trials conduct at the same time that society is shifting. And our clinical trials units are losing people up and down. It's really hard to retain people. It's really hard to hire new people. There's freezes on hiring, and clinical trial will have, I think, a longer negative impact on clinical trial conduct than we have expected because of personnel issues.
Yeah, and I will offer just one comment here. The existing trials for us work just fine, right? As I said, we maintain the vast majority of patients on those studies, even globally. What was more complex was really starting new studies, to the points that Mia said before, but also coming back to many of those, especially the early studies, are running in those clinical trial units, are running in specialized sites. And just for patients to go there and participate in those studies, that was definitely more difficult during the pandemic. And I think we need to develop new methods in order to address those issues. And what we've tried so far did not work entirely well.
I would echo that last point. Again, you know, one of the strong points we heard from patients was that they did not want to travel down to the downtown medical center for their care. If there was a satellite clinic as part of our system, they would much prefer to be at the satellite clinic. And so we have an effort to open up our clinical trials at our satellite sites for that very purpose. But we're actually getting a lot of pushback from sponsors saying they don't want to open the study at another site. Even though it's the same institution, it's technically another site, and they are giving us a lot of pushback. So I would say that despite our efforts at opening the clinical trials to inside the community where patients live and want to receive their care, we're not actually able to overcome some of those barriers.
And that was an initiative that started even before COVID, where patients were saying that and people were trying to do that, not perhaps as fast as they did. So I would encourage Jim and CDUP and SUNDUP and others not only to look back and see what maybe didn't work, but to look forward. I mean, NCI has its guidance, ASCO has its or recommendations. As we look at the protocols that are being written now, what are they incorporating as well?
Let me just say that as this session comes to a close, that those are really profound words. And the question is, can we all keep in our minds, and sometimes it's hard to keep many balls in the air, but this has been an extraordinary experience, certainly the most extraordinary experience for me in my entire research career, because I never would have thought that the government could do actually anything that was fast. And yet, you know, my colleagues, Meg Mooney and Ward McCaskill-Stevens, really working with the FDA, just made changes in an extraordinarily short period of time. That happened because, I'll be honest with you, because they actually didn't ask permission from very many people. They just went ahead and did these things. And it might have all failed, but it didn't. And so I have to be optimistic that if you can take a system, and I used to analogize the NCI's clinical trial system to something like the Great Barrier Reef, which has one layer after another on it, very difficult to scrape things off, to start from a fresh base. It actually is possible. And so the last year or so has been, to me, very optimistic. The NCI can change. Industry obviously can change. Academicians can do things differently, even though they're not exactly the way they've been taught as fellows and junior faculty. And so I think the real challenge, and one that at least I'll pledge to the extent that I have any control over any of this, is that we don't go back. We carefully evaluate what we've done to make sure that it really has been positive, but you do that in a prospective way without reverting to the ways that we've been taught for years and years. And I think this has been a very hopeful session to suggest that there are a lot of people, in fact, everyone on this session, this panel, agrees that we can't go back. We have to go forward with a new perspective on how clinical trials for cancer patients are done in the most expeditious, most flexible, and most effective way.
I always say patients don't have the luxury of patience, so I really appreciate those words, Jim.
So then with this, we'll conclude this very interesting session. I want to thank all of you for your outstanding presentations, and we'll have a short break and be back in some time. I don't know which time zone you're all in. Thank you very much.